Welcome, dear listeners, to another chilling mystery solved by the incomparable Hercule Poirot. Tonight we enter the refined world of the Rosewood Estate, where privilege, inheritance, and carefully hidden resentment collide. When the young heiress of Rosewood is found brutally murdered, beneath blooming roses and polished smiles, Poirot must untangle a web of envy, deception, and deadly ambition. Behind every fortune lies a secret, and behind every rose, a thorn. Settle in and let the little grey cells lead the way. Chapter 2. The Will That Changed the Garden. The drawing room at Rosewood Estate had been designed to impress restraint. Its walls were lined with pale silk panels, its furniture chosen for elegance rather than comfort. A grand portrait of the Fairly patriarch presided above the mantelpiece, his painted gaze stern and proprietary, as though even death had not loosened his hold on the family fortune. Hercule Poirot sat very straight upon a small settee, his gloved hands folded neatly over the silver knob of his cane. He disliked rooms that attempted to control emotion. They always failed. Around him sat the household's principal figures, arranged not by coincidence but by long habit. At the far end of the room stood Sir Geoffrey Fairlie, Isabella's uncle and legal guardian, his back rigid, his eyes fixed on a point just above Poirot's head. Beside him, perched uncomfortably on the edge of a chair, was Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne, Isabella's maternal aunt, a woman of delicate features and sharp eyes that missed very little. Near the windows stood Mr. Edward Lennox, Isabella's former fiancé, his posture casual to the point of carelessness, hands clasped loosely behind his back, and finally, seated apart from the others, her hands folded carefully in her lap, was Miss Clara Wynne, Isabella's companion and lady's secretary. Poirot surveyed them gently. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "I thank you for assembling so promptly. It is regrettable that circumstances require it." No one replied. Poirot continued. "Mademoiselle Isabella Fairlie was young, wealthy, and—" He paused briefly. "In possession of something far more dangerous than either youth or wealth." Mrs. Hawthorne shifted. "Dangerous?" Poirot inclined his head. "Choice." He turned his attention to Sir Geoffrey. "You were your niece's guardian, monsieur. You managed her affairs." Sir Geoffrey cleared his throat. "Until her 25th birthday, which would have been next month." Poirot's eyes sharpened slightly. "Ah," he murmured. "So soon." Sir Geoffrey nodded. "At that time, full control of the Rosewood Estate and the Fairlie fortune would have passed entirely to her." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And did this transition trouble anyone?" A silence followed, brief but telling. Mrs. Hawthorne spoke first. "Isabella was impulsive, idealistic. She had ideas about selling portions of the estate, restructuring investments." Mr. Lennox gave a short laugh. "She wanted independence. That's hardly a crime." Poirot glanced at him. "No," Poirot said calmly. "But it is often resented." He turned to Miss Wynne. "Mademoiselle Wynne, you worked closely with Mademoiselle Fairlie. Did she speak to you of these plans?" Miss Wynne hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, she intended to change her will." The room stiffened as one. Poirot smiled faintly. "Aha!" Sir Geoffrey's voice sharpened. "That is not accurate." Miss Wynne lifted her chin. "It is." Poirot raised a hand gently. "Please," he said. "We are not yet at accusations, only truths." He turned to Sir Geoffrey again. "Was there a will?" "Yes," Sir Geoffrey said stiffly. "Drafted years ago. The estate would remain under family trusteeship should anything happen to Isabella." Poirot nodded. "And recently?" Sir Geoffrey's jaw tightened. "She asked questions, nothing more." Poirot's gaze drifted toward Mr. Lennox. "And you, monsieur," Poirot said softly, "were once to marry Mademoiselle Fairlie." Lennox shrugged. "That ended months ago." "Why?" Lennox's lips pressed thinly. "She changed, became suspicious, accused me of caring more for her inheritance than her." Poirot studied him quietly. "And did you?" Lennox met his gaze evenly. "I cared for both." Poirot nodded. "An honest answer, if not a comforting one." He turned back to the group. "Mademoiselle Fairlie altered many things in recent weeks," Poirot said. "Her finances, her relationships, and most importantly, her will." Mrs. Hawthorne's voice trembled. Isabella never finalized anything. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Are you certain? Miss Wynne drew a slow breath. She met with her solicitor, she said quietly. Not Mr. Geoffrey's solicitor, her own. Sir Geoffrey spun toward her. Why was I not informed? Miss Wynne's voice remained steady. Because Isabella asked me not to tell you. The room vibrated with tension. Poirot rose slowly from his seat. Mademoiselle Fairlie intended to reclaim control of her life, he said. And when money shifts, emotions follow. He paced gently before the fireplace. Now let us consider the timing, Poirot continued. She dies weeks before her inheritance becomes absolute. Weeks before her revised will could be executed publicly, Sir Geoffrey whispered. You think? Poirot raised a hand. I think, he said softly, that death arrived at a very convenient moment. He stopped pacing and turned toward the windows. Tell me, Poirot said, who knew of her walk in the rose garden last night? Miss Wynne replied first. She told me, Mrs. Hawthorne nodded reluctantly. She mentioned it at dinner. Mr. Lennox smiled faintly. She told everyone. Isabella liked the garden at night. Poirot nodded. And who joined? Her? No one answered. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Because someone did, he said quietly. She did not die alone. He returned to his seat. There is something else, Poirot continued. A rose thorn was embedded in her hand. Sir Geoffrey frowned. What of it? Poirot smiled faintly. It was not broken, he said, which means she did not fall into the bush. She was standing still, long enough to grasp the rose deliberately. Miss Wynne covered her mouth. She was listening, Poirot continued. Engaged, perhaps even reassured. Mr. Lennox shifted his weight. Poirot noticed. Monsieur Lennox, Poirot said gently, did you meet Isabella last night? Lennox hesitated. Briefly. Poirot inclined his head. Where? In the garden, Lennox admitted. But only to argue. Poirot's voice remained calm. About the will? Lennox exhaled sharply. Yes. Sir Geoffrey stared at him. You never said, Lennox shrugged. Because it didn't matter. Poirot smiled faintly. On the contrary, he said. It matters greatly. Poirot folded his hands. Mademoiselle Fairlie was not murdered in anger, he said. She was silenced. The word settled heavily. She trusted someone enough to stand still among roses at night, Poirot continued. She believed the conversation would change her future. He looked at each of them in turn. And someone decided that future must not exist. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed softly. Poirot rose. Tomorrow, he said gently, we will examine finances, movements, and alibis. But today, remember this. He gestured toward the garden beyond the window. The roses did not kill Isabella Fairlie. People did, and people leave traces far more revealing than petals. The room remained silent as Poirot turned and walked toward the door. Outside, the rose garden glowed peacefully in the afternoon sun, and somewhere among its thorns, the truth continued to grow. Chapter 3. A family that smiles too quickly. The morning after the will was mentioned, Rosewood Estate felt different. It was not merely quieter, though it was that, but more deliberate. Voices were lowered, doors closed with exaggerated care, and servants avoided eye contact as though glances themselves might become incriminating. The house was no longer a home, it was a stage upon which everyone feared saying the wrong line. Hercule Poirot noticed this at once. He took his breakfast in the smaller morning room overlooking the rose garden. From his seat he could see the archway beneath which Isabella Fairlie had died. Sunlight fell gently across the gravel path, transforming the place of death into something deceptively peaceful. Poirot sipped his tea. Ah, he murmured, how quickly humans repaint reality. He was joined shortly after by Sir Geoffrey Fairlie, who appeared weary but alert, as though sleep had offered little comfort. Monsieur Poirot, Sir Geoffrey said, seating himself stiffly, you wish to speak further with the family? Oui, Poirot replied. Individually, Sir Geoffrey nodded. I will arrange it. Poirot smiled faintly. No need, he said. They will come to me, And indeed they did. The first to arrive was Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne. She entered with practiced grace, her expression suitably mournful, her black attire impeccable. She chose her seat carefully, arranging her skirt before sitting, hands folded neatly in her lap. "You wished to see me, Monsieur Poirot?" "Yes, madame," Poirot replied gently. "I wish to understand your affection for your niece." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled sadly. "I loved Isabella dearly." Poirot inclined his head. "Love takes many forms." Her smile faltered just slightly. "You were concerned about her independence," Poirot continued. "About her plans." "I was concerned for her safety," Mrs. Hawthorne said quickly. "Young women with money attract the wrong kind of attention." Poirot nodded. "And yet," he said softly, "you benefited from her restraint." Mrs. Hawthorne stiffened. "I beg your pardon." Poirot met her gaze calmly. "If Mademoiselle Fairley died unmarried and without revising her will," Poirot said, "you stood to gain." Her lips tightened. "I would rather have Isabella alive." Poirot nodded again. "Of course, one can prefer life and still accept inheritance." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes flashed briefly. "Are you accusing me?" Poirot smiled gently. "No, I am listening." She rose abruptly. "Then listen carefully. I had nothing to do with Isabella's death." Poirot bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, madame." She left quickly, heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Poirot noted the sound. Next came Mr. Edward Lennox. He entered with an air of casual confidence, as though he were late for an appointment rather than under suspicion for murder. He leaned lightly against the mantelpiece, arms folded. "You wanted to see me again?" Lennox asked. "Yes," Poirot replied. "You smile easily, monsieur." Lennox laughed. "Should I weep constantly instead?" Poirot tilted his head. "Grief reveals itself differently in different people, but smiles can be defensive." Lennox's eyes hardened slightly. "You argued with Isabella the night she died?" Poirot said calmly. "Yes." "About her will?" "Yes." "About your engagement?" "Yes." Poirot nodded. "And after the argument?" Lennox shrugged. "I left." Poirot studied him quietly. "Where did you go?" "To my room. I was angry." "Was anyone with you?" "No." Poirot smiled faintly. "Solitude again," he murmured. Lennox bristled. "You think I killed her because I was rejected?" Poirot shook his head. "I think," he said gently, "that rejection wounds pride more deeply than affection." Lennox's jaw tightened. "Isabella believed you loved her money," Poirot continued. "Did she ever threaten to remove you from her will entirely?" Lennox hesitated, just long enough. "She said she would reconsider everything." Poirot nodded. "And that frightened you?" Lennox straightened. "I loved her." Poirot inclined his head. "Perhaps, but love does not always survive disappointment." He gestured politely toward the door. "Merci, monsieur." Lennox left without another word. Finally, Miss Clara Wynne arrived. She entered quietly, closing the door behind her with care. Unlike the others, she did not sit immediately. She stood, hands clasped, eyes steady. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said kindly, "you were closest to Isabella." "Yes." "You knew her fears?" "Yes." "You knew her plans?" "Yes." Poirot gestured for her to sit. "You loved her," Poirot said gently. Miss Wynne nodded. "Yes." Poirot paused. "Tell me," he said softly, "did Isabella fear someone in this house?" Miss Wynne hesitated, then spoke quietly. "She feared being controlled." Poirot nodded. "By whom?" Miss Wynne drew a slow breath. "By everyone." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "She felt trapped," Miss Wynne continued. "Her uncle, her aunt, her fiancé. They all spoke of protection, but none of freedom." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And you?" "I encouraged her," Miss Wynne said, "to change her will, to claim her independence." Poirot nodded. "Did she confide in you the night she died?" "Yes." Miss Wynne's voice trembled slightly now. "She told me she was meeting someone in the rose garden." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Someone specific?" "Yes." Miss Wynne swallowed. "She wouldn't say who, only that the conversation would decide everything." Poirot sat back slowly. Did she seem afraid? No, Miss Wynne said softly. Hopeful. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Hope, he murmured. Often the most dangerous state of mind. He opened them again. Did she tell you where she was going afterward? Miss Wynne shook her head. She said she would return to write a letter. Poirot's gaze sharpened. A letter? Yes? To whom? Miss Wynne hesitated. She didn't say. Poirot rose. Mademoiselle Wynne, he said gently, did you write anything on Isabella's behalf? Her eyes widened. No. Poirot studied her face carefully. I believe you, he said softly. She exhaled in relief. As she left, Poirot remained standing, gazing toward the rose garden beyond the window. 3 interviews, 3 smiles, 3 denials, and beneath them all, fear. Poirot adjusted his moustache thoughtfully. They smiled too quickly, he murmured, as though cheerfulness might disarm truth. He turned toward the door. But truth, Poirot said quietly, is patient. Outside, the roses stirred in the breeze, their petals brushing against one another in gentle conspiratorial whispers. And somewhere within Rosewood Estate, the conversation that had decided everything waited to be fully uncovered. Chapter 4. Thorns Beneath Silk Gloves. By the 4th day, Rosewood Estate had begun to feel the strain of observation. It was not merely the presence of Hercule Poirot that unsettled its inhabitants, but the way he watched without appearing to do so. He asked few questions now. Instead, he listened, he lingered, he allowed silence to do the work that interrogation often spoiled. This morning, Poirot chose to walk the rose garden alone. The gardeners had been dismissed for the day, the paths left undisturbed at Poirot's request. Dew still clung to the petals, and the roses bowed under its weight as though tired of their own beauty. Sunlight filtered through the arches, catching on thorns and casting sharp shadows across the gravel. Poirot moved slowly, cane tapping softly. Roses, he murmured, are polite liars. He stopped beneath the archway where Isabella Fairley had been found. The gravel had been carefully smoothed, the disturbed earth restored with professional discretion. Yet Poirot's eyes lingered on the ground, not as it appeared now, but as it had been. He crouched. The rose bush nearest the arch had been pruned recently, too recently. Poirot examined the cut stems. Clean, he said quietly. Deliberate. A thorn lay broken at the base of the bush, not snapped by accident but twisted away. Poirot straightened slowly. Mademoiselle Fairley grasped the rose, he murmured, but someone else removed its evidence. Footsteps sounded on the gravel. Poirot did not turn. I wondered when you would come here, said Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne. Poirot smiled faintly. And I wondered when someone would wish to see what I was seeing. Mrs. Hawthorne approached, dressed immaculately in pale gloves and a tailored coat. Her expression was composed, though her eyes were sharp with curiosity. I thought perhaps I might help, she said lightly. Poirot inclined his head. Help is always welcome, provided it is honest. She ignored the implication. You must think it odd, she continued, that Isabella would meet someone here at night. Poirot studied her carefully. Odd, he said, but not foolish. The rose garden is visible yet private. One believes oneself observed yet unseen, Mrs. Hawthorne smiled. Exactly. Poirot's eyes flicked to her gloves. Madam, he said gently, may I ask, do you garden? She laughed softly. Goodness, no. I prefer to admire the results. Poirot nodded. And yet, he continued, you wear gloves suited for thorns. Her smile faltered almost imperceptibly. These? She said, lifting her hands. Leather gloves are hardly incriminating. Non, Poirot agreed. But they are practical. She changed the subject quickly. You believe Isabella trusted her killer, Mrs. Hawthorne said. Yes. And that trust came from familiarity. Yes, Mrs. Hawthorne exhaled. Then you will not look far. Poirot met her gaze. I never do. She left him there, her heels clicking crisply as she walked away. Poirot remained still. She plants seeds, he murmured, but she does not water them. Later that afternoon, Poirot requested the presence of Miss Clara Wynne in the rose garden. She arrived promptly, her steps light, her posture careful. "You wish to see me here?" she asked. "Yes," Poirot replied. "Because this is where truth was interrupted," she swallowed. "You were here often with Isabella," Poirot continued. "Yes." "At night?" "Yes," Poirot nodded. "And when one walks among roses in the dark," he said softly, "one learns to be careful." Miss Wynne hesitated. "What do you mean?" Poirot gestured toward the bushes. "Roses punish carelessness," he said. "Yet Isabella grasped one firmly enough for a thorn to embed in her skin." Miss Wynne looked away. "She was emotional," Miss Wynne said quietly. "She was upset that night." Poirot tilted his head. "Upset or resolved?" Miss Wynne said nothing. Poirot continued gently. "Mademoiselle, Isabella planned to write a letter that night." Miss Wynne's fingers tightened around each other. "She told you this?" Poirot said. "Yes." "And you never found the letter?" "No." Poirot studied her face. "Isabella was decisive," he said. "When she made a choice, she committed to it." Miss Wynne nodded slowly. "And she trusted you?" "Yes." Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then tell me, did she ask you to deliver something? Or protect something?" Miss Wynne's eyes filled with tears. "She asked me to safeguard her papers," she whispered, "in case something happened." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "Where are they?" "In my room," she said. "Hidden." Poirot nodded. "May I see them?" "Yes." They returned to the house together. The papers were neatly arranged in a leather folder, bank statements, correspondence, and a partially revised will. Not signed, not witnessed. Poirot examined it carefully. "She was close," he murmured. Miss Wynne nodded. "She said if she survived that conversation, everything would change." Poirot looked up sharply. "If she survived," he repeated. Miss Wynne's voice trembled. "She was afraid someone would stop her." Poirot nodded. "Did she name this person?" Miss Wynne shook her head. "No, but she said they wore kindness like armor." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Kindness," he murmured, "is often the sharpest disguise." That evening, Poirot observed dinner without participating in it. Sir Geoffrey sat stiffly, his eyes darting occasionally toward his wife's empty seat. Mrs. Hawthorne had excused herself early, claiming a headache. Mr. Lennox spoke animatedly, laughing a bit too loudly, while Miss Wynne remained silent. Poirot watched hands. Mrs. Hawthorne's gloves lay folded beside her plate, unused. After dinner, Poirot walked the corridors. Near the service stair he found something small but telling, a thorn, caught in the weave of a carpet runner. He knelt and removed it carefully, placing it in his handkerchief. "This," Poirot murmured, "was carried inside. Someone had left the garden in haste, someone who wore gloves, but not carefully enough." Later that night, Poirot requested Sir Geoffrey privately. "Sir Geoffrey," Poirot said gently, "tell me, who among your household is most skilled at persuasion?" Sir Geoffrey frowned. "Persuasion?" "Yes," Poirot said. "The art of making others believe they act freely." Sir Geoffrey hesitated. "My wife," he said finally. "Beatrice is influential." Poirot nodded. "And Isabella?" "She admired her aunt, trusted her." Poirot smiled faintly. "Trust again." He rose. "Sir Geoffrey," Poirot said, "did your wife know where Isabella was going that night?" Sir Geoffrey hesitated. "Yes." Poirot inclined his head. "And did she attempt to stop her?" "No." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Or did she accompany her?" Sir Geoffrey stared. "I don't know." Poirot placed the thorn gently on the desk. "This was found inside," he said softly. Sir Geoffrey's face drained of color. Poirot folded his hands. "The killer did not lurk in shadows," he said. "She walked beside Isabella, spoke gently, wore silk gloves." Sir Geoffrey whispered, "You believe my wife?" Poirot raised a hand. "Belief is not yet proof," he said, "but thorns do not lie." Outside, the rose garden rested under moonlight, beautiful, silent, and unforgiving, and within Rosewood Estate, the politeness began to crack. Chapter 5. The broken engagement rain arrived at Rosewood Estate in the early hours, thin and persistent, like a finger tapping endlessly at glass. By breakfast, the rose garden glistened, petals drooped under the weight of water, and the gravel paths darkened to a richer grey, as though the estate itself had grown sombre. The servants moved quietly, carrying trays, drawing curtains, and exchanging cautious glances. Even the air inside the house felt damp with tension. Hercule Poirot took his tea by the window, watching the rain stitch faint lines across the garden. He had slept little, not because the case troubled him — cases rarely did once the pattern began to emerge — but because people in houses like Rosewood were often at their most dangerous when they believed they were losing control. He set his cup down with precision. "The engagement," Poirot murmured, "is always a door, and doors, they swing both ways." A knock came at the door. Miss Clara Wynne entered quietly, her face pale. She carried a folded note in her hand. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I think you should see this." Poirot rose. The paper was not new. Its edges slightly softened, as though it had been handled and hidden and handled again. The handwriting was clean, feminine, and unmistakably Isabella's. Poirot read without changing expression. "Edward insists he has done nothing wrong, but he wants assurances. Always assurances. He smiles as though that should satisfy me. I am beginning to believe he loves Rosewood more than he loves me." Poirot looked up. "Where did you find this?" "In Isabella's writing desk," Miss Wynne replied. "Behind a false panel. She must have hidden it." Poirot nodded slowly. "Merci, mademoiselle." He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "And you told no one?" "No," she said quickly. "Only you." Poirot's gaze softened. "You did well." Miss Wynne hesitated, then asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Do you think Edward killed her?" Poirot did not answer immediately. "I think," he said gently, "that Monsieur Lennox has the kind of charm that often grows in the shadow of ambition." He walked toward the door. "Please," he added, "ask Mr. Lennox to meet me in the library." The library at Rosewood smelled of old leather and polished wood. It was a comforting room, until one remembered that comfort was often used as camouflage. Edward Lennox arrived with his usual air of ease, though Poirot noticed the faint tension around his mouth. "You wanted to see me again?" Lennox asked, closing the door behind him. "Yes," Poirot replied. "We will speak about your engagement." Lennox sighed dramatically. "It ended. Isabella changed her mind. That's all there is." Poirot tilted his head. "Is it?" he asked softly. He removed the note from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. Lennox stared at it. "Read," Poirot said calmly. Lennox's fingers tightened. He read quickly, then tossed the paper back as though it burned. "Private thoughts," he said. "Hardly evidence of murder?" Poirot nodded. "No, but evidence of strain." He stepped closer. "Monsieur Lennox, Isabella believed you wanted assurances." Lennox scoffed. "Of course I did. She was unpredictable." Poirot's voice remained mild. "Assurances about what?" Lennox hesitated. Poirot waited. Finally, Lennox said, "About my future, about my role, about whether she would cut me out entirely." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And she might have." Lennox's jaw clenched. "She was rewriting everything. She wanted to free herself. She said she'd be the sole decision-maker." Poirot nodded slowly. "And you?" Lennox's smile returned, thin now. "I wanted stability. Rosewood needed stability." Poirot smiled faintly. "You speak of Rosewood as though it is a wife." Lennox flushed. "It's my life." Poirot leaned forward, slightly. "Monsieur Lennox," he said softly, "where were you between 10 and midnight on the night Isabella died?" Lennox exhaled sharply. "I've already told you I returned to my room." "Alone?" "Yes." Poirot nodded. "May I see your room?" Lennox's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Poirot's voice remained calm. "Because the truth does not fear inspection." After a brief pause, Lennox nodded stiffly. Lennox's room was immaculate in the way of a man who wished to appear orderly rather than genuinely being so. His luggage was neatly arranged, his shoes aligned, his tie folded, yet Poirot's eyes noticed the small detail that betrayed pretense. A damp patch on the hem of a coat hanging behind the door. Poirot lifted the fabric gently. Mud, fresh, not garden mud. Heavier, darker, as though from the edge of a path where water pooled. Poirot turned his head slightly. "You walked outside," Poirot said quietly. Lennox stiffened. It rained. Anyone could have mud. Poirot smiled faintly. Indeed, but not everyone has mud on a coat that was worn last night. Lennox's nostrils flared. I went out to smoke, that's all. Poirot nodded. And where did you smoke? Near the terrace, Lennox said. Poirot stepped closer. Which terrace? Lennox hesitated again. Poirot's eyes remained steady. The east terrace overlooks the rose garden, Poirot said gently. And the path from that terrace leads directly to the arch where Isabella was found. Lennox's face tightened. I didn't go into the garden, he snapped. Poirot's voice remained soft. Then why is there a thorn caught in your coat seam? Lennox froze. Poirot reached carefully and plucked a small thorn from the stitching near the pocket. It was almost invisible until one looked. Lennox's mouth opened, then closed. Poirot's eyes softened slightly. Monsieur Lennox, he said, you see how small things betray the large. Lennox's voice was hoarse. Fine. I went into the garden. I spoke to her. Poirot nodded. At what time? After dinner, Lennox said bitterly. She was there. She said she was meeting someone else too. She wanted to end things properly with me. Poirot listened intently. And did you? Lennox clenched his fists. We argued. I begged. I threatened. I said she was making a mistake. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Threatened. Lennox looked away. I said, if she cut me out, I would expose certain things about her uncle, about how money was handled. Poirot's gaze sharpened. You knew of financial irregularities, Lennox swallowed. Not details, just whispers. Poirot nodded slowly. And Isabella? She said she didn't care anymore, Lennox said. She said she would burn the whole structure down rather than be controlled. Poirot exhaled softly. Then she was resolved. Lennox's shoulders sagged. I left. I swear I left her alive. Poirot looked at him with calm intensity. I believe you, Poirot said quietly. Lennox stared. You do? Poirot nodded. Because if you had killed her, Poirot said, you would not have left behind such obvious traces. You are vain, monsieur. You would have arranged the scene to appear romantic tragedy, rose petals, a dramatic fall, not quiet, contained death. Lennox flinched as though struck. Poirot continued. Tell me, who was the other person she expected? Lennox hesitated. Poirot waited. Finally, Lennox said in a low voice, her aunt, Beatrice. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And why would she meet her aunt at midnight among roses? Lennox swallowed. Because Beatrice promised to help her, to smooth things over with Sir Geoffrey, to make the will change acceptable. Poirot nodded slowly. Kindness like armor, he murmured. Lennox looked up sharply. What did you say? Poirot did not answer. Instead, he walked to the door. Monsieur Lennox, Poirot said gently, you are not innocent of greed, but greed is not always murder. Sometimes it is merely convenient silence. Lennox's face flushed. I'm not a killer. Poirot paused. No, he said softly, but you have stood close enough to killers to feel their heat. He left the room. That night, Poirot walked the corridor outside Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne's chambers. He did not knock immediately. He listened. Inside there was the faint sound of movement, drawers opening, paper shifting, a hurried breath. Poirot knocked softly. Madame Hawthorne, he called. It is Poirot. Silence. Then the door opened a fraction. Mrs. Hawthorne stood there in a robe, her face carefully composed. Monsieur Poirot, she said sweetly, how unexpected. Poirot smiled faintly. Madam, he said, I find the unexpected most revealing. He lifted his hand slightly. I would like to speak about the meeting in the rose garden. Her eyes did not widen. That, Poirot noted, was the most telling reaction of all. Instead, she smiled. Of course, she said softly. Come in. Poirot stepped into the room, and as the door closed behind him, the air felt suddenly heavier, like roses before a storm. Chapter 6. Secrets Rooted in Rosewood. Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne's sitting room was a careful portrait of elegance. Everything had been arranged to suggest softness, pale lampshades, embroidered cushions, a vase of cream roses on a side table. Even the faint scent in the air, lavender and something sweeter, seemed selected to calm, to reassure, to make one forget that beneath silk every body still carried bone. Hercule Poirot stood just inside the threshold, as if he were measuring the room's intentions before stepping fully into them. "Madam Hawthorne," he said gently, "you have excellent taste." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled. "How kind. Please sit. Tea?" "No, merci," Poirot replied. "Tonight, I prefer clarity." Her smile remained, though it tightened at the corners. Poirot did not sit. He walked slowly, examining the room with polite attention. His eyes passed over framed photographs, porcelain figurines, a silver brush set, objects meant to speak of refinement and harmlessness. Then he stopped at the writing desk. An open drawer had been hastily pushed in, not quite flush. Poirot glanced at it, then looked back at Mrs. Hawthorne. "Madam," he said softly, "you were searching for something when I knocked." Mrs. Hawthorne laughed lightly. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot, a woman is always searching for something. A missing brooch, perhaps. Or a button." Poirot inclined his head. "Or a letter." Her eyes flickered, so quickly but not quickly enough. Poirot stepped closer. "Let us not pretend," he said gently. "You met Isabella in the rose garden on the night she died." Mrs. Hawthorne sighed, as though he had asked something tiresome rather than deadly. "Yes," she said. "I did." Poirot nodded. "At what time?" "Shortly before midnight," she replied. "She sent word through Clara. She insisted." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "She insisted?" "Yes," Mrs. Hawthorne said smoothly. "She wanted to speak privately. About her will, no doubt." Poirot folded his hands behind his back. "And what did you say to her?" Mrs. Hawthorne's expression softened, performed softness, like an actress offering the audience a tragic smile. "I told her I loved her," she said, "that she was free to make her own choices, that I would support her." Poirot tilted his head. "Aunt Beatrice," he murmured, "wrapped in kindness." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "You think kindness is a crime?" Poirot smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "But it can be used as a weapon." He paced slowly. "Your niece intended to change her will," Poirot said. "She intended to reduce family control." Mrs. Hawthorne lifted her chin. "If she did, it was her right." Poirot stopped pacing. "And yet," he said softly, "you benefited from her old will." Mrs. Hawthorne's smile returned, brittle now. "Everyone benefits from someone's will eventually, Monsieur Poirot. That is the nature of inheritance." Poirot nodded. "And the nature of greed." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes flashed. "Careful!" Poirot's voice remained calm. "Madame," he said, "what happened after you spoke in the garden?" Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated just a fraction, then said, "We argued." Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Ah," he murmured. "So kindness did not last." Mrs. Hawthorne's face hardened. "Isabella was ungrateful. She accused me of manipulation. She spoke cruelly." Poirot nodded. "And you—" "I told her she was naive," Mrs. Hawthorne snapped. "That she did not understand consequences." Poirot watched her carefully. He had seen this before. When the polished exterior began to crack, the anger beneath slipped out like smoke from a sealed box. "You told her," Poirot said softly, "that she could not change her life without breaking others." Mrs. Hawthorne's breathing quickened. "Something like that." Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And then Isabella said she would expose the truth." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. "What truth?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Secrets rooted in rosewood," he murmured. Mrs. Hawthorne's posture stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." Poirot turned away as though bored by denial, and moved toward the desk drawer that did not sit flush. He opened it gently. Inside lay a bundle of papers, half hidden beneath a lace handkerchief. Mrs. Hawthorne moved suddenly. "Don't touch that!" Poirot's hand paused. He looked at her. "Madame," he said calmly, "your reaction is instructive." Mrs. Hawthorne stood rigid, her face pale. Poirot withdrew the top sheet carefully. It was an old letter, yellowed paper, ink faded in places. The handwriting was elegant and masculine. The letterhead bore a crest, Fairly and Sons. Poirot read silently, then his eyes sharpened. The letter was addressed to a name Poirot had not expected, Beatrice Hawthorne, and it spoke of Isabella's mother. Poirot's voice was quiet. "This letter," he said, "concerns an old arrangement, a scandal, a secret settlement." Mrs. Hawthorne's lips trembled, but she forced composure. "It's private," she said. Poirot nodded. "All secrets are private until murder makes them public." He read a key line, not aloud in full, but enough for meaning to land. "The Fairly fortune," Poirot said softly, "was not entirely fairly." Sir Geoffrey's name appeared in the letter, as did a mention of inheritance conditions, trust structures, guardianship, silence. Poirot looked up. "Madame," he said gently, "did Isabella discover this?" Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes glistened with fury and fear. "She had no right," she whispered. Poirot nodded slowly. "And yet she did." He placed the letter back carefully. "I think," Poirot continued, "that Isabella learned something about her mother's death, or her mother's marriage, or the legitimacy of the fortune. Something that would have changed how Rosewood belonged." Mrs. Hawthorne's voice shook. "You don't understand." Poirot tilted his head. "Then help me." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes flashed. "Rosewood survives because we keep order," she hissed, "because we keep the family intact, because we do not allow foolish girls to burn everything down for truth," Poirot offered gently. Mrs. Hawthorne's breathing grew sharper. "Truth is a luxury, stability is necessity." Poirot stepped closer. "And Isabella disagreed." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes filled, tears not of sorrow but of rage. "She wanted to change the will," she said bitterly. "She wanted to cut Geoffrey out, cut me out, give parts of the estate away, sell land to strangers, donate money. She wanted to erase the Fairly legacy as though it meant nothing." Poirot nodded. "So you met her in the garden to persuade her?" Mrs. Hawthorne's jaw tightened. "Yes." Poirot's voice lowered. "And persuasion failed." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes flickered to the side, toward the small cabinet near the window where a decanter sat, half full, Poirot noticed. "Madame," he said softly, "did you bring Isabella tea that night, or wine?" Mrs. Hawthorne froze. Poirot's eyes remained calm. "A gentle conversation," Poirot said. "Among roses, a warm drink, a soothing scent of lavender, a woman standing still, trusting, and then—" Poirot paused. "Then she grew weak." Mrs. Hawthorne's lips parted slightly. Poirot's voice was almost tender. "She did not struggle," he continued. "She did not run, she did not fight, because she could not." Mrs. Hawthorne's face drained of color. Poirot stepped back. "Poison," he said softly. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice broke. "I didn't want to kill her." Poirot nodded slowly, as if he had expected this confession to begin, not end, here. "You wanted to stop her," Poirot said, "to keep Rosewood stable, to keep your secret buried." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes were wet now. "She threatened to tell everyone about her mother, about the settlement, about Geoffrey, about me." Poirot's moustache twitched. "And so you chose silence, permanent silence." Mrs. Hawthorne shook her head violently. "It was supposed to make her sleep, just sleep so I could talk to her in the morning when she calmed down." Poirot's voice sharpened slightly, though still controlled. "But you miscalculated the dosage." Mrs. Hawthorne collapsed into a chair, trembling. "It was an accident," she whispered. Poirot's eyes remained steady. "Madam," he said gently, "accidents do not excuse choices." He turned toward the door. "You will come with me," Poirot said calmly. "We will speak with Sir Geoffrey and the authorities." Mrs. Hawthorne stared up at him. "You'll destroy everything." Poirot shook his head. "No," he replied. "You destroyed it the moment you decided the truth was too dangerous to live." He opened the door, and as the corridor air rushed in, cooler and less perfumed, Rosewood Estate seemed to breathe differently, as though the house itself knew the roots of its secrets had finally been exposed. Chapter 7. An alibi that bloomed too perfectly. The revelation in Mrs. Hawthorne's sitting room did not immediately shatter Rosewood Estate. That, Hercule Poirot reflected, was the most dangerous thing of all. Houses like Rosewood were trained to absorb shock, scandal, grief, and betrayal were not strangers here. They were guests, politely escorted through side corridors, acknowledged in whispers, then buried beneath routine. Even murder, if left unmanaged, could be folded into decorum, but Poirot did not intend to leave it unmanaged. As dawn broke over the estate, pale light crept through the tall windows. illuminating a house suspended between collapse and denial. Servants resumed their duties with exaggerated normalcy. Breakfast was served precisely on time. Curtains were drawn back with ceremonial care. Only the faces betrayed the truth. Sir Geoffrey Fairley sat alone in the breakfast room, his untouched plate before him, staring at nothing. He looked older than he had days ago, as though decades had arrived overnight and claimed their due. Poirot entered quietly. "Sir Geoffrey," Poirot said gently. Sir Geoffrey looked up, his eyes hollow. "You spoke with Beatrice." "Yes," Poirot replied. Sir Geoffrey swallowed. "And?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he poured himself a cup of tea, allowing the ritual to anchor the moment. "Sir Geoffrey," Poirot said at last, "do you believe your wife incapable of harm?" Sir Geoffrey's lips trembled. I believed she was strong, protective." Poirot nodded. "Many people confuse those qualities." Sir Geoffrey leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "She told me she was in her room all night, that she retired early with a headache." Poirot's eyes softened. "An alibi," he said, "that bloomed too perfectly." Sir Geoffrey looked up sharply. Poirot continued calmly. "It is the alibis that fit too well that deserve the most scrutiny. Your wife ensured she was seen retiring. She excused herself publicly. She created witnesses without witnesses ever seeing her sleep." Sir Geoffrey closed his eyes. "She never left the house," he whispered. Poirot nodded. "No, she did not need to." That morning, Poirot requested the presence of the household staff. They assembled in the long gallery, maids, footmen, gardeners, standing stiffly beneath portraits of long-dead Fairleys who had never been asked for their opinions. Poirot addressed them with gentle authority. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "I ask only honesty, not loyalty, not protection, only truth." He turned first to Mrs. Hathaway, the housekeeper. "You retired Mrs. Hawthorne for the evening." "Yes, monsieur," Mrs. Hathaway replied. "She complained of a headache and said she would not require anything further." Poirot nodded. "And after that?" Mrs. Hathaway hesitated. "I saw her once more." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "When?" "Close to midnight," she said. "She came downstairs quietly, asked for warm water." Poirot inclined his head. "And did you think this strange?" "No," Mrs. Hathaway said. "Mrs. Hawthorne often struggled to sleep." Poirot smiled faintly. "Indeed." He turned to a young maid. "You were on duty near the East Wing?" "Yes, sir." "Did you see Mrs. Hawthorne leave the house?" The maid shook her head. "No, sir." Poirot nodded. "Did you see her return?" The maid hesitated. Poirot waited. "Yes," the maid said softly. "She came in through the garden doors. Her gloves were wet." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Poirot's voice remained calm. "At what time?" "After midnight," the maid replied. "Not long before Mrs. Hathaway found the doors still unlocked." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci." He dismissed the staff gently. Sir Geoffrey, who had been listening from the doorway, looked as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. "She lied," he whispered. Poirot nodded. "Not convincingly enough." Later that afternoon, Poirot arranged a final meeting in the drawing room. All remaining principals were present. Sir Geoffrey sat stiffly, his face pale. Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne sat beside him, impeccably dressed, her composure restored almost too fully. Edward Lennox stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, eyes darting. Miss Clara Wynne sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. Poirot stood before them. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "we have spoken of motive, opportunity, and method. Now we speak of alibi." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled faintly. "I've already given mine." Poirot returned her smile gently. "Yes," he said, "and it is excellent." Her smile tightened. "Too excellent," Poirot continued. He began to pace slowly. "On the night Isabella Fairley died," Poirot said, "each of you played a role, some by action, others by silence." He turned toward Edward Lennox. "Monsieur Lennox, you argued with Isabella. You threatened exposure, but you left her alive." Lennox nodded stiffly. Poirot turned to Miss Wynne. "Mademoiselle Wynne, you protected her papers. You believed truth would save her." Miss Wynne lowered her gaze. Poirot turned to Sir Geoffrey. "Monsieur, you believed stability was kindness." Sir Geoffrey's voice broke. "I was wrong." Poirot nodded. Then he turned to Mrs. Hawthorne. "And you, madam," Poirot said softly, "believed control was love." Mrs. Hawthorne lifted her chin. "I protected this family." Poirot stopped pacing. "You protected an illusion." He gestured toward the windows. "You met Isabella in the rose garden. You brought her a warm drink, laced not to kill, but to weaken." Mrs. Hawthorne said nothing. "You told her you supported her, that you would help manage the transition. You spoke softly, kindly." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And when the poison took effect, she did not fall immediately. She stood, she grasped a rose, perhaps to steady herself." Poirot held up a small evidence bag. "The thorn." Mrs. Hawthorne's lips trembled slightly. "You waited," Poirot continued, "until her breathing slowed, until her body betrayed her. Then you arranged her gently beneath the arch, ensuring no marks of violence." Poirot paused. "And then you returned to the house, wet gloves, a headache, an alibi." Silence fell thickly. Mrs. Hawthorne finally spoke. "You cannot prove intent," she said quietly. "Only accident." Poirot inclined his head. "Intent," he said, "is revealed not by words but by preparation." He gestured toward a small table where a tray had been placed. On it sat a delicate porcelain cup. "The poison," Poirot said softly, "was measured, dissolved, mixed carefully with something fragrant to mask bitterness." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes flickered. "And after," Poirot continued, "you removed evidence, pruned the rose bush, cleaned your gloves, returned to your room." Poirot stepped closer. "Your alibi bloomed beautifully," he said, "but like all things cultivated too carefully, it betrayed its gardener." Mrs. Hawthorne's composure finally cracked. Tears slipped free, silent and furious. "I didn't mean to kill her," she whispered. "She was destroying everything." Poirot's voice remained gentle but firm. "She was reclaiming herself." Sir Geoffrey stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You killed my niece," he said hoarsely. Mrs. Hawthorne looked up at him, devastation etched across her face. "I tried to save us," she whispered. Poirot raised a hand. "This is no longer a family matter," he said quietly. "It is a matter of justice." Footsteps sounded in the corridor. The authorities had arrived. As Mrs. Hawthorne was escorted away, she paused at the door and looked back at Poirot. "You think truth is better than stability," she said bitterly. Poirot met her gaze calmly. "I know it is," he replied, "because stability built on lies always collapses." When the door closed, the room felt suddenly empty. Miss Wynne wept quietly. Edward Lennox stared at the floor. Sir Geoffrey sank into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Poirot adjusted his moustache thoughtfully. "The rose garden," he murmured, "will bloom again. But never quite the same." Chapter 8. The Poisoned Petals. The rose garden did not look like a crime scene anymore. By the time Chapter 8 began to unfold, the authorities had completed their work. The archway had been cleared, the gravel swept, the trampled petals replaced with deliberate care. Only those who knew what had happened could still feel it, the faint wrongness in the air, like a note played just off key. Hercule Poirot returned to the garden alone. He did so not because evidence remained, there was little left to discover, but because understanding often required revisiting the place where intention and consequence met. Poirot believed that every murder left behind not only clues but echoes. And echoes, unlike footprints, could not be swept away. He stopped beneath the rose arch. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground with gentle warmth. The roses were open again, their fragrance heavy and sweet, almost oppressive. "Poison," Poirot murmured, "is always polite. It did not shout, it did not chase. It asked only patience." He knelt and examined the rose bush that had once borne the broken thorn. It had been pruned again since his last visit. Carefully this time, with nothing hidden, the gardener had done his duty, restoring order where chaos had briefly intruded. Poirot rose slowly. "Order," he said softly, "is what killed her." He walked along the path Isabella Fairley had taken on her final night, imagining the sequence not as a detective but as a human being. Isabella had walked willingly, expecting conversation, resolution, perhaps even reconciliation. She had trusted the familiar voice beside her, trusted the gentle tone, the comforting words. And then, weakness. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. A woman poisoned rarely collapses dramatically. There is no grand gesture. Instead, there is confusion, a heaviness in the limbs, a dizziness mistaken for emotion. One leans, one steadies oneself, one reaches for the nearest thing, the rose. Poirot opened his eyes. She did not know she was dying, he said quietly. That is the cruelty. Footsteps approached behind him. Miss Clara Wynne stopped a few paces away, hesitant to intrude. She had not slept much in days. Grief clung to her like a second skin. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, "I thought I might find you here." Poirot smiled faintly. "Gardens attract those who seek answers." Miss Wynne looked around. "It looks ordinary again." "Yes," Poirot replied. "That is how houses survive tragedy. They return to routine as quickly as possible." She swallowed. "And people?" Poirot did not answer immediately. "They try," he said at last. They walked together toward a stone bench near the far hedge. Poirot gestured for her to sit. "You knew Isabella better than anyone," Poirot said gently. "Tell me, did she ever speak of poison?" Miss Wynne frowned. "Poison?" "Yes," Poirot said. "Not as a method, but as a metaphor." Miss Wynne thought for a moment. "She used to say that control was like poison," she said slowly. "That it worked quietly, that people didn't realize how sick they were until it was too late." Poirot nodded. "A perceptive woman." Miss Wynne's eyes filled. "She was so close to freedom." "Yes," Poirot said softly. "And freedom frightens those who depend upon control." They sat in silence for a moment. "Monsieur Poirot," Miss Wynne asked hesitantly, "do you believe Mrs. Hawthorne hated Isabella?" Poirot considered this carefully. "No," he said. "I believe she loved her. Terribly." Miss Wynne looked up sharply. Poirot continued. "Love that insists upon obedience becomes possession. Possession, when threatened, becomes violence," Miss Wynne whispered. "She killed her because she loved Rosewood more." Poirot nodded. "Yes, and because she believed the estate mattered more than the woman who inherited it." Miss Wynne wiped her eyes. "Will the truth ruin everything?" Poirot shook his head gently. "Truth does not ruin," he said. "It rearranges." That afternoon, Poirot met once more with Sir Geoffrey Fairley. They sat in the study, a room heavy with history and regret. Papers lay scattered across the desk. Documents that once represented power, now reduced to symbols of failure. Sir Geoffrey looked up as Poirot entered. "I should have listened to her," he said quietly. "I should have trusted her judgment." Poirot nodded. "Hindsight is a harsh teacher," Sir Geoffrey sighed. "Beatrice believed she was preserving the family." Poirot's eyes were kind but firm. "She preserved an idea," he said, "not a person." Sir Geoffrey's shoulders sagged. "Is that why poison was chosen?" Poirot raised an eyebrow slightly. "Explain." Sir Geoffrey gestured helplessly. "It's discreet, controlled, like her." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Poison reflects the killer's nature. It avoids confrontation. It disguises violence as misfortune." Sir Geoffrey stared at the papers before him. "She even arranged her alibi like a schedule," he whispered. Poirot allowed himself a faint smile. "Yes," he said, "and schedules always reveal who controls them." Sir Geoffrey looked up. "Will the courts understand?" Poirot folded his hands. "They will understand enough," he said. "But understanding is not the same as healing." Sir Geoffrey nodded slowly. "What will become of Rosewood?" Poirot glanced toward the window, where the rose garden lay bathed in afternoon light. "It will endure," he said, "but it will belong to fewer illusions." That evening, Poirot prepared to leave. The house was quieter now, not tense, but subdued. The servants moved without whispers, doors closed without caution. The weight had lifted, though the cost remained. Poirot stood in the entrance hall, adjusting his coat. Miss Wynne approached, holding a small envelope. "She wrote this," Miss Wynne said, handing it to him. "The letter she meant to finish." Poirot accepted it carefully. "I thought you should have it," she added. Poirot opened it only enough to read the first line. "If you are reading this, then I was not brave enough, or fast enough." Poirot closed the envelope gently. "Merci," he said softly. "This belongs to truth." Miss Wynne hesitated. "Will you read it?" Poirot shook his head. "No," he said. "Some words are meant to be heard only once." He tucked the envelope safely away. As he stepped outside, the air was cool and clear. The roses stirred in the evening breeze, their petals catching the last of the sunlight. Poirot paused at the gate. "Poisoned petals," he murmured, "teach us this." He looked back once more at Rosewood Estate. "When beauty becomes a shield for control," he said softly, "it ceases to be innocent." The motorcar door opened. Poirot entered, and as Rosewood slipped quietly into the distance, the garden remained behind, still blooming, still beautiful, but forever changed by the truth rooted beneath its soil. Chapter 9. The Heiress's Final Decision. The road away from Rosewood Estate was lined with trees that had stood for generations, oak, elm, and chestnut, each trunk thick with time, each branch trained by wind into shapes that suggested endurance rather than grace. The motorcar carried Hercule Poirot at a measured pace, the countryside unfolding beyond the window like a quiet confession. Yet Poirot's thoughts remained behind, among the roses. Truth had been spoken. A culprit had been taken. The household had begun, already, to stitch itself back together. But Poirot knew that the real end of a murder did not arrive with an arrest. It arrived when the living finally understood what the dead had decided. A soft knock sounded at the glass, separating his compartment from the driver. The car slowed. Poirot frowned slightly and leaned forward. The driver's voice came through the narrow opening. "Pardon, Monsieur Poirot, a messenger from Rosewood has caught up with us. He insists it is urgent." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Bring him," Poirot said calmly. Moments later, a young footman appeared at the roadside, breathless, clutching a small parcel wrapped carefully in cloth. His cheeks were flushed from running, and his eyes were wide with anxious determination. "Monsieur Poirot," he panted, "Miss Wynne sent this. She said you must have it before you go." Poirot accepted the parcel gently, as if it were fragile. "Merci," Poirot said. "You have done your duty." The footman bowed and hurried back down the lane. Poirot opened the cloth wrapping slowly. Inside was an envelope, thicker than the one Miss Wynne had handed him the previous evening. The seal was unbroken. On the front, in Isabella's handwriting, was written a single line, "For when Rosewood finally listens." Poirot held it in his hands for a long moment. He did not like reading the private words of the dead. It felt in some way like trespassing. But Poirot also understood that the dead did not leave words behind for comfort. They left them for necessity. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded the papers within. There were 3 items. 1. A letter addressed to Miss Clara Wynne. 2. A shorter letter addressed to Sir Geoffrey Fairley. 3. A page of notes, unfinished but sharp with intent. Poirot began with the letter to Miss Wynne. Isabella's writing was steady, composed, and unmistakably alive. "Clara, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong, either in the garden or in the house that pretends it is safer than the world outside. Do not blame yourself. The trouble at Rosewood began long before either of us understood it. I am going to meet Aunt Beatrice tonight. She believes she can persuade me. She believes she can soften the world with polite words and call it love. If I return, I will finish what I started. If I do not return, then promise me you will not let Rosewood bury me beneath manners. You know where the papers are. You know what they mean. If they try to call it an accident, you must refuse. Tell the truth, even if it makes you lonely." "I would rather be lonely than owned," Poirot exhaled softly. "Ah," he murmured, "so brave." He turned to the second letter, addressed to Sir Geoffrey. It was shorter, more direct. "Uncle Geoffrey, I have been patient. I have been polite. I have pretended that your fear is the same thing as your love. It is not. You have controlled Rosewood in my name while pretending you were protecting me. You have hidden things from me because you believed I could not bear them. Perhaps you did not believe I deserved them. Tonight, I will decide whether you are family or merely a custodian of my life. If you wish to remain in my future, you must stop using my mother's memory as a weapon. You must stop allowing Aunt Beatrice to manage this house through guilt and control. Rosewood will change, either with your help or without it." Isabella Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly as he finished. This was not a girl writing from impulse. This was a woman claiming sovereignty. Poirot placed the letters aside and picked up the final page, the notes. They were rougher, as though written quickly in a moment of anger and clarity. Names appeared, dates, fragments of events. Then Poirot saw the line that made his expression still. "Mother did not die the way they told me." He read the sentence again. The note continued. "They say it was her heart, but the doctor's letter suggests otherwise. I must confront Aunt Beatrice. She knows what happened. She always knew." Poirot's gaze sharpened like a blade. So that was it. Not only inheritance, not only control, but a deeper secret. One rooted not in money, but in history. Poirot leaned back, the papers resting in his hands. "Secrets," he murmured, "do not vanish. They change shape." The motor car continued forward, the countryside sliding past. Poirot's mind returned to the rose garden that night, Isabella hopeful standing beneath the arch. Her aunt approaching, gloves on, voice soft, a warm drink, a conversation that began as persuasion and ended as silencing. Poirot could imagine it now with painful clarity. Isabella would have spoken of her will first, then of her mother, then of the doctor's letter, and at some point, perhaps when Isabella's voice sharpened, perhaps when she named a suspicion aloud, Mrs. Hawthorne's kindness would have tightened into something colder, a smile, a reassurance, and a dose. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Isabella had not simply been murdered to preserve money. She had been murdered to preserve a story that kept certain people noble, certain memories clean, and certain sins unspoken. Poirot opened his eyes and tapped the papers lightly with his finger. "Rosewood," he murmured, "did not want to listen." He signaled to the driver to turn back. The motor car slowed and pivoted. Poirot did not relish returning. Cases were finished when truth was established. But this was not merely truth. This was the victim's final intention. If Isabella's death was to be understood fully, the living had to know what she had chosen. They arrived at Rosewood Estate in the late afternoon. The house looked calmer than before, as though it had convinced itself the storm had passed. Yet calm in such places was often the calm of denial. Miss Wynne met Poirot at the door, eyes swollen from crying. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, startled, "you came back." Poirot nodded gently. "Yes," he said, "because Isabella has spoken." In Sir Geoffrey's study, Poirot laid the letters on the desk. Sir Geoffrey read them slowly, his hands trembling. When he reached the line, "family or merely a custodian of my life," his face crumpled. "She was right," he whispered. "She was right about everything." Poirot waited. Sir Geoffrey turned to him, voice hoarse. "She suspected Beatrice knew something about her mother." Poirot nodded. "Yes." Sir Geoffrey stared at the papers as though they might burn through the desk. "What did Beatrice do?" he whispered. Poirot's voice was soft but firm. "She did what she has always done," Poirot said. "She controlled the narrative, and when Isabella threatened to change it, she silenced her." Miss Wynne began to cry quietly. Sir Geoffrey's fists clenched. "She killed her to protect the family name," he said bitterly. Poirot shook his head. "She killed her to protect herself," he said gently. "The family name was simply a convenient cloak." Sir Geoffrey swallowed hard. "What was the truth about Isabella's mother?" Poirot held his gaze. "That," Poirot said, "will be decided by evidence and courts, but Isabella's final decision was clear." He tapped the letter to Miss Wynne. "She chose truth over comfort," Poirot said, "freedom over approval, loneliness over ownership." He looked at Miss Wynne. "And she entrusted you with it?" Miss Wynne nodded through tears. "I'll do what she wanted." Poirot's eyes softened. "Then," he said, "Isabella's death will not be buried beneath manners." Outside, the rose garden glowed in the lowering sun. It looked peaceful, but now, at last, it was listening. Chapter 10. Poirot and the garden that learned to listen. The drawing room at Rosewood Estate had been prepared with care. Chairs were arranged in a precise semicircle, the curtains drawn back to admit the late afternoon light, the fire laid but unlit. It was a room meant for conclusions, neither accusatory nor forgiving, but final. Hercule Poirot stood near the mantelpiece, hands folded neatly behind his back, surveying the faces assembled before him. Sir Geoffrey Fairley sat rigidly in his chair, his expression grave and worn. Edward Lennox stood apart, arms crossed, jaw tight. Miss Clara Wynne sat quietly, her posture straight, eyes fixed on Poirot with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. Two uniformed officers waited discreetly near the door. Poirot cleared his throat softly. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "we are here not to prolong suffering, but to complete understanding." He paused, allowing the silence to settle. "When Mademoiselle Isabella Fairley was found beneath the rose arch," Poirot continued, "many believed the matter would be simple. A young woman, a private walk, a tragic end. But simplicity is rarely truthful when wealth and control share a roof." He turned slightly, indicating the windows that overlooked the garden. "Rosewood was built to suggest permanence," Poirot said. "Stone, land, lineage. Yet permanence depends not on walls, but on honesty. When honesty is withheld, pressure builds, like sap beneath bark." He lifted a hand. "Let us begin with motive." Poirot's gaze moved to Edward Lennox. "Monsieur Lennox," he said gently, "you loved Isabella, or believed you did. But your love demanded assurances. You feared exclusion from her future and sought leverage. You argued with her the night she died." Lennox swallowed and nodded. "Yes," he said hoarsely, "but I did not harm her." Poirot inclined his head. "No, you did not. Your greed was loud. Murder, in this case, was quiet." Poirot turned to Sir Geoffrey. "Monsieur Fairley," he continued, "you managed Rosewood in your niece's name. You believed stability was kindness. You hid truths to protect a structure you loved." Sir Geoffrey closed his eyes. "I thought I was shielding her." Poirot nodded. "Shielding," he said softly, "often blocks the light." Poirot then turned slowly to the final empty chair, the place where Beatrice Hawthorne had once sat. "Madame Hawthorne," Poirot said quietly, "believed control was devotion." He gestured toward the officers. "Mrs. Hawthorne met Isabella in the rose garden under the guise of reconciliation. She brought a warm drink, fragrant, soothing, and laced with poison. Not enough, she believed, to kill, enough to weaken." Miss Wynne drew a sharp breath. Poirot continued, his voice steady. "The poison took effect gently. Isabella grew dizzy. She did not struggle. She did not flee. She reached for a rose to steady herself, embedding the thorn that spoke for her when she could not." Poirot held up the small evidence bag containing the thorn. "Mrs. Hawthorne arranged the scene carefully. She laid Isabella beneath the arch, pruned the bush to remove damage, cleaned her gloves, and returned to the house to complete her alibi." He paused. "An alibi too perfect." Sir Geoffrey's shoulders sagged. Poirot nodded toward the officers. "The law will take the rest from here." One officer stepped forward and spoke quietly. "Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne has been charged. She has offered a full statement." A murmur moved through the room. Poirot raised a hand gently. "There is more," he said. "Murder answers how. It does not always answer why." He reached into his coat and removed the letters Isabella had written. "These," Poirot said, "are Isabella's final decision." He read aloud only a single line. "I would rather be lonely than owned." The words hung in the air. Poirot looked at Miss Wynne. "Mademoiselle," he said kindly, "you were entrusted with truth. You kept it." Miss Wynne nodded, tears in her eyes. Poirot turned to Sir Geoffrey. "Monsieur," he said, "your niece discovered a deeper secret, one concerning her mother's death and the story that had been preserved in its place. She chose to confront it," Sir Geoffrey whispered. "She was braver than any of us." Poirot inclined his head. "Yes," he said, "and that bravery frightened those who depended upon silence." Poirot stepped back, folding his hands once more. "The tragedy of Rosewood," he said, "is not that a young woman died. It is that she died because she wished to live honestly." He looked toward the garden again. "Poison was chosen not for cruelty, but for convenience. It avoided noise, it avoided witnesses, it preserved appearances, and appearances at Rosewood were valued above all." He turned back to the room. "But appearances crack," Poirot said, "like marble under pressure, like petals under frost." The officers moved quietly to depart. As they did, Poirot spoke one last time. "Mademoiselle Fairley's death cannot be undone," he said. but her decision can be honored. The truth about Rosewood, about its money, its past, its silences, must now be spoken. Sir Geoffrey nodded, tears finally spilling free. It will be. Poirot offered a small, respectful bow. Later, as the sun dipped low, Poirot stood alone at the garden gate. The roses glowed softly in the evening light. They were imperfect now, some petals bruised, some stems pruned unevenly, but they were alive, honest in their scars. Poirot adjusted his moustache thoughtfully. "Gardens," he murmured, "do not belong to those who control them. They belong to those who tend them with truth." He opened the gate and stepped onto the path beyond. The motor car waited. As it pulled away, Rosewood Estate receded into the distance, no longer a monument to silence, but a place newly forced to listen. Poirot allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Cases would come and go, houses would endure and crumble, but again and again he saw the same pattern. When control masqueraded as love, it poisoned everything it touched. He closed his eyes briefly. "Truth," he said softly, "is never gentle, but it is the only thing that allows life to grow." The countryside rolled past, open and unguarded, and somewhere behind him, roses bloomed, not perfectly but freely. The end,